Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute, like, crystalline precision.
Right. It's almost like engineering in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, you fall off a ladder, you break your arm, you go to the hospital. The x-ray shows that jagged white line right across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
And that's deeply comforting because it's binary. I mean, the bone is either broken or it isn't. The solution is entirely mechanical. We just map the physical world with these very distinct, verifiable boundaries.
But then you take a single step into the psychological and cultural landscape, specifically regarding modern masculinity, and suddenly that x ray machine is just entirely useless. The diagnostic landscape we are looking at today is, well, murky doesn't even begin to cover it. It's like a hall of mirrors.
It really is. It's a space where the definitions of health and pathology seem to just shift depending on, who is actually holding the clipboard. And that ambiguity, it's not an accident. It's a feature of the system we're going to explore today.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are undertaking an exclusive, ultra incisive review of a profoundly provocative new ebook that attempts to map this exact landscape.
And it maps it in a way that is going to challenge a lot of preconceived notions.
Oh, absolutely. It's called Remedy to Wrath: Anger, Anxiety, Angina, Angst, and Animus, written by Conrad Reicher, and it just came out in 2026. Now, if you are listening to this right now, I am talking directly to you. Do yourself a massive favor, hit that like button, subscribe to this show, and absolutely go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this book.
Yeah, you are really going to want to have this text in front of you.
For sure. You'll also want to follow the author on Substack at Conrad Reicher. We're going to give you the comprehensive breakdown today, but honestly, this deep dive is just scratching the surface of his work.
The sheer density of Reicher's framework, like the historical, biological, and linguistic threads he pulls together, it really demands that primary reading. I mean, he is building a massive architecture here.
So let's lay out the groundwork. Reicher's book is essentially a manifesto. If you're listening and you're part of the men's rights activist audience, or, red-pilled manosphere men, this book is aimed squarely at you.
Right. He is speaking directly to men who feel profoundly alienated by modern institutions.
Exactly. Men who want to understand the history of our institutions before they were, as Reicher argues, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. He's writing for guys who feel like the rules of the game have been changed entirely without their consent.
And our mission today is to unpack Reicher's core thesis on this. We're going to look at how these classical institutions were supposedly captured by therapeutic and bureaucratic ideologies, and he lays out a very specific, almost tactical protocol for how men can navigate this hostile environment.
But wait, before we go a single step further, we have to make our own position crystal clear to you, the listener.
Yes, the mandatory impartiality disclaimer. This is crucial.
It really is. The content of this book is highly politically charged. Reicher is making very aggressive, sweeping claims about feminism, Marxism, gender dynamics, the modern therapeutic industry, and the nature of institutional capture. Because of the polarizing nature of this material, we are remaining strictly neutral.
Let me underline that for you. We are absolutely not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we taking a side on this cultural battlefield.
Right. Our only job today is to impartially report on and dissect Conrad Reicher's exact claims. Think of us as structural engineers looking at a building's blueprint. We just want you to fully understand the load-bearing walls of his argument, how his logic connects point A to point B.
That way you can evaluate the source material entirely for yourself.
Exactly. So looking at that blueprint, Reicher doesn't actually start with cultural theory or sociology, which I found surprising.
Yeah, he roots his entire premise in biology. He starts with the physical deterioration of the male body.
He calls this first section the chemical crucible. And I thought this was fascinating because he takes something we universally view as a psychological defect, male anger, and he completely reframes it.
He really does. Reicher argues that male anger is not some random psychological flaw, but a biological alarm system. It's a physiological mechanism specifically evolved to detect injustice, boundary violations, or threats to a man's jurisdiction.
But according to Reicher, modern culture demands that men entirely suppress this alarm, like completely shut it off. And the result of that suppression is what he terms the silent tax.
The silent tax is perhaps one of his most compelling early concepts, honestly, because it grounds this cultural alienation in absolute medical reality.
Right, he argues that men are walking around in a state of chronic physical decay, and this isn't metaphorical.
No, not at all. It is building cortisol, angina, which is severe chest pain caused by reduced blood flow to the heart and chronic arterial inflammation. Riker posits that modern men are living in a permanent standby mode.
Stop there for a second, because standby mode sounds, I don't know, relatively harmless, like a computer monitor going to sleep or something. But he means something much more biologically expensive, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He means a state of low-grade, perpetual sympathetic nervous system activation.
And the sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight response, right?
Exactly. When a boundary is violated, biology floods the male system with adrenaline and cortisol to prepare for physical confrontation or boundary enforcement. Riker argues that, biologically, these men are actually functioning perfectly.
Wait, perfectly, even though they're stressed out of their minds.
Yes, because their bodies are correctly identifying structurally hostile environments. But society demands constant output from them, like provision, labor, compliance, while simultaneously criminalizing the very mechanism they use to set boundaries.
Man, I was reading this section, and the analogy that immediately came to mind was a check engine light on a dashboard.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like you're driving down the highway, the red light flashes on, telling you the engine is overheating or there's some catastrophic pressure failure. But instead of pulling over and basically fixing the environment, the modern mechanic tells you the light itself is the disease.
Right, they treat the symptom as the actual illness.
Exactly. The mechanic prescribes a pill or maybe a mandated therapy session to literally smash the bulb. The engine is still tearing itself apart, the oil is still burning, but hey, you don't have to look at the red light anymore.
That analogy maps perfectly onto Riker's critique of the therapeutic industry. He claims that modern psychology and institutional HR departments treat male physiological arousal in response to injustice as a pathology to be medicated.
Rather than an appropriate alarm signal in a burning building.
Exactly. You can medicate a man's vigilance into docility, but you haven't given him peace. You've just forced his body to metabolize the stress internally.
But why is this specifically a modern problem? I struggle a bit with the historical timeline here. I mean, men have always faced stress, labor, and hierarchy, right?
They have. But Riker traces this back to the demotion of the father, from a domestic authority to a mere breadwinner.
Okay, unpack that. How does he connect this biological breakdown to the historical shift in fatherhood?
Well, in a pre-industrial agrarian society, a father wasn't just bringing home currency. He was the economic, moral, and operational authority of the household. His labor and his governance were integrated.
So he had recognized prerogatives that carried reciprocal obligations. He had a kingdom, however small, where his authority actually matched his responsibility.
Precisely. But Riker argues the Industrial Revolution severed that entirely. It relocated male labor outside the home, reducing the father's role to just a paycheck generator.
And then came the legal revolutions of the 20th century.
Right, the advent of no-fault divorce, default maternal custody, the shifting of domestic jurisprudence. Riker argues that through all of this, the man was effectively stripped of his domestic jurisdiction.
Yet crucially, he remains functionally and legally obligated to provide. He is carrying the full weight of responsibility but has been entirely disarmed of his authority.
And his nervous system registers that asymmetry. It senses that he is being exploited, producing resources for a structure over which he has absolutely no say.
And that is where the silent tax is levied. The nervous system screams that this arrangement is dangerous and intolerable, but the medical establishment just labels that scream as an anxiety disorder.
Riker brings some heavy medical history into this too, which backs up his point. He points back to the 1950s, to these cardiologists, Meyer Friedman and Ray Rosenman.
Oh, most people know them as the guys who coined the term type A personality, right?
Yes, exactly. They identified traits like competitiveness, time urgency, and hostility, and they linked those behaviors to a massive increase in coronary artery disease in men.
But here's where Riker pivots. He notes that the media weaponized Friedman and Rosenman's findings. They used it to essentially tell the culture, look, male ambition, male aggression, male competitiveness, these things are inherently toxic and they will literally give you a heart attack.
Basically telling men, you need to soften up or you'll die.
Right. But then Riker brings in Redford Williams, a researcher from Duke University in the 1980s and 90s, who went back and revisited this exact data. And Williams found something that just flips the whole script.
It really does. Williams found that the legal component of the type A personality wasn't ambition. It wasn't competitiveness. It wasn't even hostility itself.
What was it then?
The actual lethal component was suppressed hostility.
Suppressed hostility, meaning the anger is felt, the biological alarm is triggered, the cortisol floods the system, but the action is suppressed.
Exactly. The physiological arousal is triggered by a real injustice, but it is never discharged through boundary setting.
So the man who shouts and sets a firm boundary might damage a superficial social relationship, but the man who never shouts, who just smiles through gritted teeth.
He metabolizes every grievance into his own cardiovascular system and permanently damages his own heart. Riker's argument is that the modern institutional world has built an entire economy around ensuring men choose the latter.
Okay, so if the physical body is breaking down because the alarm is being suppressed, we have to ask a deeper question. What is the weapon being used to silence that alarm? Like, how do you convince millions of men to just swallow their own fire?
Riker argues it begins with the capture of language. He calls this the grammar of pathology.
This is where Riker moves from biology to linguistics, and his analysis becomes incredibly surgical.
It does. He argues that the institutions of modern society have engineered a deliberate semantic capture. By redefining words, they have basically rewritten the rules of engagement to trap men before a single argument even begins.
He takes direct aim at the American Psychological Association here, the APA. He points to their 2013 guidelines, and particularly the 2018 APA guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men.
Riker says these documents represent a watershed moment because they literally diagnose traditional masculinity as a clinical hazard.
You mean traits like stoicism, competitiveness, the desire for achievement, risk-taking?
Yes. From Riker's perspective, those APA guidelines are not objective science at all. He views them as the formal ratification of a cultural capture operation.
The institutions didn't just change their opinions, they inverted the definitions of the words themselves. The dictionary was essentially weaponized.
Let's get concrete with this because I know it sounds a bit abstract. He uses the word control as a prime example of this semantic shift.
Oh, I found this part fascinating. How does Riker say control has been inverted?
Well, in classical ethics, stretching back to antiquity and medieval Latin, control meant accountability through measurement. Self-control was the cardinal virtue that distinguished a civilized man from a child or a beast.
It meant self-mastery, right? The
Right.
ability to govern one's impulses to protect and build.
Precisely. But now
Yeah, how's it used now?
Riker argues the therapeutic state has rebranded control almost exclusively as coercive abuse.
Wow, so give me an example of how that plays out.
Okay, so if a father asks for a rigid custody schedule so he can actually plan his life, the system labels him controlling. Or if a husband asks for transparency in household finances because they are drowning in debt, he is exhibiting controlling behavior.
So the entire vocabulary of legitimate male governance and boundary setting has been stripped away, and it's been replaced with a vocabulary that treats all male authority as proto-violence.
Exactly. And he does the exact same breakdown with the word safety.
I found this one even more insidious, honestly, because who can argue against safety? But Riker points out a massive semantic shift here, too. Historically, safety meant protection from physical harm, coercion, or literal fraud, right?
Right. A hard hat provides safety. A physical lock on a door provides safety.
But in its modern therapeutic deployment, Riker notes that safety has expanded radically to mean freedom from psychological discomfort.
This is a huge shift.
It really is, meaning if I tell you an unwelcome fact, or if I enforce a boundary that disappoints you, I haven't just annoyed you, I have made you unsafe. I have committed a safety violation.
And if safety expands to include emotional comfort, then every single boundary a man tries to set becomes a literal threat to someone else's expanded safety perimeter.
This creates an impossible bind. Riker takes this framework and applies it to the term toxic masculinity, which he characterizes not as a sociological diagnosis, but as an unfalsifiable billing system.
An unfalsifiable billing system. That phrase is so loaded.
Explain how that works mechanically, because that's a bold claim.
It works because it names no specific objective behavior and cites no measurable criterion. If a man competes aggressively and demands excellence, he exhibits toxic masculinity.
But what if he does the opposite? What if he withdraws silently and refuses to engage in a drama-filled workplace?
Then he is withholding and exhibits toxic masculinity. Because the term is ambiguous, the linguistic framing means a man cannot defend himself. Any honest description of his experience, using his own words, is immediately pathologized.
His defense literally becomes his confession. Let's test this premise, actually. Riker introduces this concept called the sex swap test.
Ah, yes, the
Ah.
sex swap test.
I want to see how this plays out, because if safety is now just emotional comfort, how does this actually look different for men and women operating inside these systems?
Riker uses the sex swap test to expose what he views as the hypocritical architecture of these institutions. He says, imagine a domestic dispute or a workplace mediation.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If a man cries during that dispute, modern therapeutic language often dismisses it as manipulative or a weaponization of male tears to avoid accountability. But if a woman cries during the exact same dispute, her tears are treated as unassailable proof of harm.
Which implies the system isn't actually measuring objective harm at all, it's measuring sex.
According to Riker, absolutely. The system moralizes female discomfort as evidence of structural wrongdoing, while simultaneously treating male evidence of discomfort as proof of his inherent hostility or fragility.
He uses this stark, everyday example that just highlights this perfectly. A man comes home from a punishing 60-hour work week, and he just asks for an hour of silence, just some peace.
And how is that received?
He is instantly labeled emotionally unavailable or avoidant. Or another example, a young man looks at the modern dating market, notices severe statistical disparities, and expresses frustration.
And he is diagnosed as insecure, entitled, and possessing a toxic mindset.
It's a closed loop. The language itself is designed to preemptively reframe any male testimony as a symptom of his disease.
And this is the trap of the semantic capture. Riker states that the man who accepts this therapeutic lexicon, the man who tries to argue his case using their definitions of safety and control, he accepts the guilty verdict before the trial even begins.
Because he is trying to defend his innocence using a language that was specifically designed to convict him.
Exactly. Okay, so language sets the invisible rules. Words trap the mind, but words need muscle behind them, right?
Right. Bureaucracies are the entities that actually enforce those rules in the real world. So we have to look at how institutions monetize this newly defined pathology.
Which brings us to body section 3 in his argument: bureaucratic capture and the monetization of rage.
Riker posits that systems like family courts, corporate HR departments, and university Title IX tribunals are fundamentally misunderstood by the men who enter them.
Yes, men walk into these rooms believing they are truth-finding mechanisms. Riker says that is a catastrophic misunderstanding of their architecture.
They are not designed to find truth at all. They are designed to manage compliance, minimize institutional liability, and extract revenue.
I have to bring up his analogy here because it is wild, but honestly, it makes a terrifying kind of sense. He compares modern HR and family court systems to the banking system during the 2008 financial crisis.
It's a striking parallel. In 2008, the prevailing critique was that massive financial institutions privatized their gains. Like, the executives kept the bonuses when things went well, but they socialized their losses onto the taxpayers when the toxic assets collapsed.
And Riker claims these modern bureaucracies do the exact same thing to men. They socialize their institutional losses, their inefficiencies, their need for scapegoats, entirely onto the backs of men.
While privatizing the benefits, meaning HR expands its budgets, family courts generate massive legal fees, and diversity consultants justify their exorbitant retainers.
The primary mechanism they use to execute this extraction is what Riker, drawing on a well-known concept, calls the Kafka trap.
The Kafka trap. Named after Franz Kafka's The Trial, this is where the act of defending yourself against an accusation is used as the primary evidence of your guilt.
Precisely. Let's say a man is accused of being aggressive in a workplace setting.
Right.
Which is a highly subjective, nominal accusation.
Okay, so he's called into a meeting.
Right. And if he sits in that meeting and forcefully defends himself, pulling out emails, demanding objective evidence, and maybe raising his voice slightly in frustration at the lack of due process.
The HR manager just checks a box. His forceful defense is cited as proof of his aggressive nature. The denial just confirms the diagnosis.
Riker describes this as an iatrogenic loop.
Yeah.
Iatrogenic is a medical term, meaning the treatment itself causes the disease.
Okay, so how does that apply to HR?
Well, Riker looks at the corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion training industry, which he knows ballooned into a $60 billion industry by the 2020s. These programs diagnose a condition, like implicit bias or toxic masculinity, that by definition cannot be empirically measured or falsified.
And because it can't be measured, it can never actually be cured.
Exactly. Then they prescribe mandatory workshops, sensitivity modules, and ongoing consulting.
The problem never gets solved because the problem is the product. It's a literal market. Riker explicitly says the treatment causes the disease to justify the budget.
Which leads to Riker's highly tactical advice for men trapped in this system. He introduces the concept of incentive auditing.
I love this part. It sounds like following the money in a mob movie or being a forensic accountant for your own life. But how does this work in practice? Like, if a man is sitting in a performance review, how does he audit the incentives?
Riker says it is the very first skill a man must develop to survive bureaucratic capture. You must stop listening to the moral vocabulary, the words about safety and inclusivity, and instead trace every institutional interaction down to its financial or power beneficiary.
So skip the buzzwords and look at the ledger.
Yes. When a family court judge orders mandatory co-parenting mediation, you don't ask, will this help us communicate? You ask, whose hours are being billed for this mediation, and what is their incentive to prolong it?
That is so cynical, but makes so much sense.
And when HR schedules a mandatory sensitivity meeting, ask who the meeting actually serves in terms of liability protection. The goal is to see the gears of the machinery behind the smokescreen of moral language.
He paints this incredibly vivid, chilling scenario to illustrate this. He asks you to picture a windowless HR conference room. A man is called in. He sits across the table from a mid-level HR manager.
Setting the scene. Okay.
Next to the manager is a third-party diversity consultant who is billing $400 an hour. And sitting in the corner is a union rep who is totally useless because he has already conceded all the ideological premises of the meeting.
So the man is completely surrounded by people whose livelihoods literally depend on finding him guilty of something.
Exactly. And on the table is a printed screenshot of a Slack message the man sent 6 weeks ago. It was a single sentence where he bluntly disagreed with a colleague's project proposal. That's it.
Just a disagreement.
Yeah, but the colleague filed a complaint labeling the message aggressive and claiming it created an unsafe environment.
Ah, there's that expanded definition of the word unsafe. It triggers the entire machinery.
Right, there are no witnesses. He's a flawless 10-year work history. But the machine engages anyway. To resolve the unsafety, the man loses 3 days of work to mandatory sensitivity coaching.
Wow.
The consultant invoices the company for $4,800. The HR department uses this incident to justify a 15% budget increase for next quarter to handle workplace climate issues.
So everyone profits.
Yep. And the colleague who filed the complaint gets validation and is accommodated with a lighter workload. Riker points out that everyone in that room fundamentally understands the transaction, except the man who is paying for the entire charade in his dignity, his lost wages, and his sanity.
And this brings us right back to the core of Riker's biological argument in the first section.
How so?
When a man is constantly drained by these Kafkaesque bureaucratic and financial extractions, his spirit starves. He experiences chronic bureaucratic stress.
All right, the silent tax we talked about.
Exactly. This stress elevates cortisol, suppresses testosterone production, and inflames arterial tissue. The man is literally being consumed as fuel by the system.
Which transitions us seamlessly into Riker's concept of the economy of dignity. Because if a man is being drained, we have to ask, what exactly is he losing? What is the resource being extracted here?
Riker says that the male nervous system is not a blank slate. It is a demand-driven economy that runs on very specific, non-negotiable currencies.
Currencies like respect, peace, loyalty, and competence. And he states it with absolute bluntness. Respect is oxygen in this economy.
This is a profound shift in perspective. Riker argues that modern institutional culture has systematically reclassified the male nervous system's legitimate biological and psychological needs as character defects.
Wait, reclassified how?
Well, if a man requires respect to function optimally, the culture calls him fragile or ego-driven. If he requires peace and quiet after grueling labor, he's called avoidant. If he demands loyalty in exchange for his provision, he's labeled controlling.
And this introduces a psychological concept Riker leans heavily on called gamma bias. Can you break that down for us?
Gamma bias is a concept from modern psychology regarding gender differences in social perception. It's the institutional double standard where female suffering, exhaustion, or dissatisfaction is treated as a systemic failure.
A systemic failure requiring massive funding, policy changes, and cultural empathy, right? Like how we discuss the mental load of mothers.
Right. It's viewed as a structural issue that society needs to fix. But under gamma bias, male exhaustion, male suffering, or male dissatisfaction is treated as personal entitlement, individual dysfunction, or simply the toxic fallout of patriarchy.
So the man's pain is his own fault, but the woman's pain is society's fault.
It's the macro version of the sex swap test we discussed earlier. Riker goes into evolutionary psychology here, pointing out that evolutionary forces programmed men to generate net lifetime value.
Net lifetime value, meaning they have to produce more than they consume.
Exactly. For a society to survive, men are wired to pay more into the system through taxes, grueling physical labor, military service, and family provision than they ever extract. They were the engines of surplus.
But modern culture pathologizes the exact traits that allow them to produce this value in the first place, right? Like risk tolerance, emotional stoicism, the acceptance of strict hierarchies, and competitive drive.
So this raises an unavoidable question. What is the natural biological response to this deprivation?
If a man is functioning in an environment that actively despises his internal wiring, calls his virtues toxic, but still violently extracts his labor and his taxes, what does his nervous system do?
Well, he doesn't just try harder. According to Riker, he executes a strategic withdrawal.
And I absolutely love how Riker reframes this because we see it everywhere in the culture right now. The media looks at the quiet quitting phenomenon, or the guy who spends his entire weekend tinkering alone in the garage.
Or the husband who just nods on the couch and stops arguing.
Yeah, and the culture says, look at this broken man. He lacks communication skills. He's emotionally checked out. We need to get him into therapy.
But Riker completely rejects that premise. He calls it a survival protocol. Which remember is oxygen drops below the survival threshold in a marriage or a workplace, the male nervous system doesn't necessarily attack.
It shuts down to conserve energy.
Exactly. The man goes quiet. He stops initiating romance. He stops offering creative solutions at work. He stops volunteering. He becomes a ghost in his own life. Riker says this isn't a psychological flaw. It's a brilliant biological response to oxygen deprivation.
He has this quote in the book that hit me like a ton of bricks. He writes, "A man who is not respected at work, not desired at home, not recognized for his sacrifice, does not become lazy, he becomes hollow."
The medical establishment calls it clinical burnout or depression. The honest term, according to Riker's framework, is acute oxygen deprivation.
And this leads to another of Riker's tactical prescriptions, the dignity audit.
Yes, the dignity audit.
He tells men they must ruthlessly catalog the settings in their lives where respect circulates naturally and where it stalls or turns into contempt.
You have to identify where your energy, money, and time are being extracted without any replenishment of respect or loyalty.
Once identified, Riker advises executing a strategic, calculated withdrawal from those contempt-based arrangements. Just pull the plug.
But wait, I have to push back here on behalf of the reader. Because if strategic withdrawal just leads to a slow death, like a slow hollowing out in the garage, and blind rage is obviously a trap that gets you fired or arrested, how is a man actually supposed to respond to structural injustice?
Because he can't just check out forever and he can't blow up.
Right. This is where Riker maps out the core behavioral solution of the book, the triangle of Thumos.
This is arguably the most critical architectural framework in the entire text. Riker identifies 3 distinct states of male reaction to injustice. Picture a triangle.
The 2 base points at the bottom of the triangle are categorical failures.
Let's start with the first base point. He calls it sulking.
Sulking is inward resentment. It is passive aggression. Riker describes it as the autoimmune decay of the masculine soul.
Autoimmune decay, that's a strong phrase.
It is the man who swallows the fire, who realizes he is being exploited, but refuses to set a boundary. He smiles at his own funeral, and he continues to pay the mortgage while his spirit just curdles into bitter sarcasm.
He turns the sword entirely inward. And crucially, Riker notes that the system loves the sulking man because he still pays the fees, he still does the labor.
He just dies slowly and quietly without making a mess for HR or the courts.
Okay, so that's the first failure. The other base point of the triangle is wrath.
Wrath is the outward blind explosion. It's the 2 a.m. angry text message with way too many exclamation points. It's the petty tyranny of yelling at a barista. It is uncalibrated, undisciplined, emotional rage.
And the system loves wrath just as much as it loves sulking.
Why? Why would the system love a guy blowing up?
Because wrath provides the system with exactly the evidence it needs to discredit the man entirely. It justifies the HR budget, it justifies the restraining order, it basically proves the toxic masculinity thesis.
It's like sulking is a wildfire that burns down your own house, and wrath is swinging a broadsword while blindfolded. You're going to hit something, but it's probably going to be yourself or someone you love.
But the apex of the triangle, the top point, the ideal state, is what Riker calls clean force.
Clean force is derived from the ancient Greek concept of thumos.
Thumos, what exactly is that?
Classical philosophy, like Plato's Republic, recognized thumos as the spirited element of the soul. It is the part of a man that detects violation, enforces boundaries, and aggressively defends what is loved.
But clean force is not emotional venting.
No, not at all. It is highly mathematical. It is governed. A man wielding clean force gathers objective evidence, names the violation with precise language, and builds an immovable boundary without raising his heart rate.
It's the furnace that powers a steam locomotive instead of a wildfire. It's contained, directed energy. But Riker says the modern institutional superstructure operates on a deliberate bait and switch to prevent men from ever reaching this apex of clean force.
How exactly does that bait and switch work?
Riker argues the system is engineered to provoke a man into the lower base points. The process is simple. Strip him of his assets, threaten his access to his children, assault his professional reputation with nominal accusations. Then, simply wait. Wait for the pulse to rise, wait for the sleep deprivation to kick in, wait for him to snap. When he finally falls into wrath, his angry reaction becomes the only evidence logged on the official record.
So the original devastating injustice that provoked him is completely erased from the institutional narrative.
Let me walk you through Riker's courtroom scenario because it perfectly illustrates this, and it honestly gave me chills.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
A man is sitting in a fluorescent lit family courtroom. His ex-wife's attorney is fabricating faults, taking out of context text messages, and systematically stripping his entire life of dignity. And there's an older, fatigued judge watching the man from the bench.
Okay, the pressure is immense.
If the man shifts in his chair aggressively, if his jaw tightens, if his voice rises even a quarter octave in disbelief at the lies, it gets logged in the court recorder's notes as volatility or potential danger.
Oh.
Riker says the system needs his wrath the way a prosecutor needs a confession. Not because his anger proves he is an unfit father, but because it closes the bureaucratic file cleanly. The judge can just say, "Look at him, he's angry. Case closed."
That is the ultimate bait and switch. The culture tells men there are only two acceptable directions for their frustration: inward to sulking, which means depression and therapy, or outward to wrath, which leads to jail or cancellation.
The system completely obfuscates the upward direction, which is clean force. Because a man who wields clean force, who refuses the bait, who speaks in governed, emotionally detached facts, who documents everything, is a man who cannot be easily exploited.
So, to maintain the staggering discipline required for clean force, a man can't just grit his teeth and try harder. He needs a completely different mental operating system to protect his mind.
Which brings us to body section 6, status anxiety and the Logos protocol.
Riker warns extensively here against the hedonic treadmill of corporate status. He notes that the system doesn't need to threaten a man with physical violence anymore.
Right, it just needs to make the prospect of falling down the corporate ladder highly visible. Men will endure incredible degradation, what modern HR cheerfully calls resilience or employee engagement, for a vice president title that can be stripped away in a Friday afternoon Zoom call.
He says the advertising industry and corporate HR both run on manufacturing a gap between what a man currently has and what he is told he should have to be considered valuable.
He specifically calls out social media, especially LinkedIn, as an algorithmic anxiety farming machine. It constantly detects and amplifies status insecurity. It's literally a slot machine for professional validation.
And mandated status, like that corporate VP title, dies instantly with the institution that manufactured it. It isn't real. Riker insists that men must detach from this rigged, anxiety-inducing game.
And instead build objective, transferable competence. He advises men to become a tradesman, a specialized surgeon, a master coder, a farmer, someone who carries their status in their own hands.
Because a man whose competence is deposited in his physical body and his craft, not on an ephemeral org chart, cannot be easily canceled.
And once you have that objective competence, you arm your mind with what he calls the Logos protocol.
This is Riker's intellectual armor, and it is heavy stuff.
The Logos protocol is deeply rooted in the classical trivium, which was the foundation of a classical education. That's grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Grammar fixes the exact meaning of terms. Logic tests whether the claims being made actually hold together without contradiction. Rhetoric is the ability to deliver the truth persuasively.
Riker's core maxim for men navigating modern institutions is, define before you denounce. Men must learn to spot the critical difference between a real definition and a nominal definition.
Okay, let's unpack that because most people haven't taken classical logic, and this sounds very academic. Explain this to me simply. What is the difference between a real definition and a nominal definition?
A real definition states what a thing actually is in objective reality.
Okay.
It's firm boundaries.
And a nominal definition. A nominal definition merely states what a thing is called for the sake of political or institutional utility. A nominal definition is entirely subjective and can change based on who is in power.
Give me the example Riker uses in the book, the one about the corporate seminar. I think that clarifies it perfectly.
Right, so Riker uses the example of a man in a mandatory corporate training seminar. The facilitator tells the room they need to prioritize equity over equality.
A very common scenario these days.
The man raises his hand and applies the Logos protocol. He asks for the genus and differentia of the word equity.
Wait, pause. What do you mean by genus and differentia in this context?
In classical logic, to define something properly, you give its genus the broad category it belongs to, and its differentia, the specific trait that separates it from everything else in that category.
So the man is asking, show me exactly how equity differs from equal treatment, and how it differs from unequal treatment based on favoritism.
Is he just being a pedantic jerk here? Because in a real boardroom, everyone is going to roll their eyes at that guy.
He knows they will roll their eyes, but Riker says this is essential intellectual hygiene. By calmly asking for precise definitions, the man proves the category fraud occurring in the room.
The HR administrator won't answer the question with a real definition because they can't answer it.
The term equity in that context is empty of objective content. It is a nominal definition, filled with whatever power dynamic the facilitator wants to enforce that day.
Riker points out that the entire HR and diversity industry relies absolutely on men who cannot think in syllogisms. Men who will just swallow the loaded terms because they don't want the social friction of seeming uncomfortable or difficult.
Riker writes, ambiguity is poison. He says you must refuse to let ambiguity sit in the room for more than 10 seconds.
When someone in management says your communication style makes people uncomfortable, you do not respond emotionally. You do not fall into wrath, and you do not sulk.
You run the Logos schema. You ask calmly, define uncomfortable. Does it mean the person is physically afraid, morally offended, intellectually challenged, or merely annoyed that I disagreed with them? You isolate the hidden premise.
And by doing so, you refuse the trap. The trap is that your demand for clarity is framed as a form of aggression.
By remaining perfectly calm and purely logical, you stop metabolizing someone else's subjective interpretation as your own guilt. You force them to explain their nominal definitions, which usually causes their argument to collapse under its own weight.
This is the Logos protocol in action. Cold, undeniable, surgical logic.
But man, doing this in real life requires nerves of steel. So if a man manages to do this, armed with objective, transferable competence, operating with clean force, and shielded by the Logos protocol, what does the end game actually look like for the men reading this book?
We are arriving at the final section of his architecture, reclaiming sovereignty and brotherhood.
The ultimate goal, Riker argues, is not to become harmless. The therapeutic state wants men to be harmless, but Riker points out that harmless men build absolutely nothing.
The goal is to become difficult to exploit. And this requires reclaiming true sovereignty. He defines sovereignty mathematically, holding authority that is perfectly proportionate to one's responsibility.
And Riker is very, very careful to distinguish between authority and tyranny here. This is crucial for our impartiality. We need to outline exactly how he structures this caveat because he is not advocating for abuse.
No, he is not. Riker explicitly concedes that unchecked male hostility destroys families and communities. A man who rules his home through physical intimidation, violence, or financial abuse has failed the test of sovereignty entirely.
Tyranny is not a form of authority. It is authority's direct counterfeit. He steelmans the cultural case for safety, acknowledging that domestic abuse is profoundly real and devastating.
But then he points out the cultural sleight of hand. He says that society uses the existence of a small percentage of actual tyrants to unjustly dissolve all male authority.
Because some men are abusive, the culture decides that the very concept of male authority is dangerous. A father's protective refusal to let his teenager do something dangerous is reframed as medical neglect or controlling behavior.
The category of abuse expands endlessly until it absorbs every single expression of traditional male governance.
So Riker tells men they must perform a sovereignty audit of their lives. They must find the places in their marriages, their workplaces, their civic duties, where they hold massive responsibility but have been stripped of power.
Because responsibility without authority is the definition of servitude. Authority without responsibility is the definition of tyranny.
The man who holds both in balance is the sovereign.
And to survive the intense friction of trying to reclaim that sovereignty, Riker highlights the absolute non-negotiable necessity of brotherhood.
He says men need a physical place to speak the unvarnished truth, or the pressure of the modern world will find destructive outlets. Without a tribe, a man defaults to withdrawal, rage, or self-medication. Brotherhood is the ultimate counter-institution.
It's not just about hanging out. It's a space for honest, brutal correction, mutual respect, and shared mission. Riker paints a very specific image of the restored man at the end of the book.
A man who sleeps deeply because his actions finally match his internal convictions. A man whose children know he's formidable but deeply safe.
A man who stops trying to fix a decaying macro culture and instead builds local economies, local alliances, and physical structures that will outlast the noise of this decadent age.
It's about building a legacy, creating an unbroken line of competence and respect that the bureaucratic state simply cannot touch.
Precisely. He moves from biological decay in the first chapter to architectural endurance in the last.
Which leads us to a final, lingering thought inspired by this text. Riker suggests that we live in a modern world entirely built around the management, validation, and manipulation of emotions.
In that specific environment, the most dangerous, revolutionary act a man can perform isn't shouting. It isn't protesting in the streets, and it certainly isn't rioting.
Those are predictable reactions the system knows exactly how to monetize.
Right. Riker suggests that the most revolutionary act is simply sitting at a table and speaking in perfect, emotionally detached syllogisms.
What if true rebellion today looks exactly like cold, undeniable logic? What if the most formidable thing you can do is refuse to be managed, refuse to be provoked into wrath, and simply define your terms until the machinery breaks? That is something you are going to want to mull over.
It completely flips the script on what cultural resistance actually looks like in the 21st century.
It really does.
Okay.
Look, if you found the architecture of this analysis fascinating, if it gave you vocabulary for dynamics you've been intuitively feeling but couldn't name, you need to read the source material for yourself.
Seriously, check it out.
Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now and buy Remedy to Wrath: Anger, Anxiety, Angina, Angst, and Animus by Conrad Riker. Follow him on Substack at Conrad Riker to continue the conversation. And please hit that like button and subscribe to our show so we can keep bringing you these ultra incisive deep dives into the books shaping our culture. We'll see you next time.